Before human beings walked upon the earth, before great mammals dominated the plains, and long before the first flowers bloomed under the ancestral sun, there existed a completely different world. It was the late Jurassic period, approximately 146 million years ago, when gigantic dinosaurs roamed primitive forests of conifers, tree ferns, and cycads. In this ancient and wild world, the legend of Kurupyr emerges, the first guardian of the forests, an entity that transcends time and whose name would echo through the ages until reaching the indigenous peoples of South America. This is the story of how the sacred protection of the forests was born, of how the consciousness of the forest gained form and purpose, and of how an eternal spirit began its infinite vigil over the green realm that covered vast extensions of the supercontinent Gondwana. Chapter 1. The World of the First Forests. The sun rose over a landscape that few modern eyes could imagine. The forests of the late Jurassic were living monuments of a different era, where colossal trees stretched toward the moisture-laden sky. They were not the broad-leaved trees we know today, but rather ancestral conifers, primitive araucarias, and gigantic tree ferns that formed a dark green canopy over the ground, covered with mosses and luminescent fungi. The air was dense and humid, laden with the smell of wet earth and decomposing matter. Insects the size of modern birds buzzed among the fronds of ferns, while small primitive mammals, no larger than rats, hid in the shadows of twisted roots. The sound of the forest was a constant symphony, the distant cry of pterosaurs flying over the canopy, the heavy walking of herbivorous sauropods that made the earth tremble, and the incessant whisper of wind through millions of leaves and needles. At this time, the supercontinent Gondwana still held together the lands that would one day become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. The forests stretched for thousands of kilometers, connected in a living network of interdependent ecosystems. There were no borders, no divisions, only the forest, vast and primordial, pulsing with a life as ancient as the planet itself. It was in this setting of wild majesty that something unique began to form, something that the forest itself was generating in response to a deep need. The oldest trees, some more than 1,000 years old, began to resonate with a collective consciousness. Their roots, intertwined beneath the earth, formed a network of chemical and electrical communication. They shared nutrients, alerted each other to dangers, and slowly, very slowly, developed something that resembled collective thought. Chapter 2. The Birth of Green Consciousness. An immeasurable time passed, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, while the forest awakened to itself. The oldest trees became the neurons of this green brain, and their intertwined roots formed the synapses that transmitted information across kilometers of living soil. Mycorrhizal fungi served as chemical messengers, transporting signals from one tree to another, from one area of the forest to distant regions. The forest began to perceive cycles. It noticed when rains came and went, when the great herbivores migrated in search of food, when predators hunted in clearings. It felt pain when natural fires, sparked by lightning, consumed parts of its green body. It experienced silent joy when new trees sprouted from the ashes, renewing the eternal cycle of life. But something more was happening. The forest's consciousness was not content merely to observe and react. It began to desire, to have intention. It wanted to protect itself, preserve the delicate balance that kept all life forms in harmony. And somehow, mysteriously, through processes that defy understanding, the forest began to concentrate its consciousness, to focus it on a single point, in the heart of the oldest forest, where trees were so ancient that their canopies touched the clouds, and their roots penetrated deeply into the oldest layers of earth. Something began to take shape. It started as a greenish luminescence among the trees at dusk, a phosphorescence that pulsed to the rhythm of the forest's own heartbeat. The animals perceived it first. Small mammals avoided that area, but not from fear, from reverence. Herbivorous dinosaurs that grazed nearby became calmer, more peaceful. Even fierce predators, sharp-toothed theropods that hunted among the trees, felt something different when they approached that sacred place. Chapter 3. Kurupyr takes form. Kurupyr's physical manifestation was not instantaneous. It took decades for the forest's consciousness to condense enough to create a tangible form. First appeared the feet, not human feet, but living roots that intertwined and merged, taking the appearance of limbs capable of walking. The legs formed from young, flexible trunks, covered with moss and lichen. Kurupyr's torso was a masterpiece of nature, a fusion of living wood and green flesh, where tree bark served as skin and sap flowed like blood. Inside his chest, where a heart should be, there was a pulsing core of green light, the concentrated essence of forest consciousness. This core glowed with the accumulated wisdom of millions of trees, the memory of countless seasons, and deep love for life in all its forms. His arms were long and strong, capable of embracing the trunks of the oldest trees as if they were brothers. His hands had fingers that resembled branches, flexible but powerful, capable of both extreme gentleness and terrible strength when necessary to protect his domain. But it was Kurupyr's face that truly captured his dual nature. Viewed from the front, he possessed almost humanoid features. Deep eyes that glowed with golden-green light, a nose formed by a protruding wood knot, and a mouth that could smile or roar. But there was something disturbing about this face, something that was not entirely human nor entirely plant. It was a face that belonged to the wild forest, primitive and untamed. And then there was Kurupyr's most peculiar and significant characteristic, his backward-facing feet. This was not a deformity, but a profound symbol of his purpose. Kurupyr did not walk toward where he was going, but from where he came. He did not follow trails, but created them by confusing those who tried to follow him. His steps deceived eyes and minds. When you thought he was going in one direction, he was actually heading another. He was the perfect protector, impossible to track, impossible to predict. Chapter 4. The Guardian's First Steps. When Kurupyr took his first step, the entire forest felt it. It was as if a sleeping giant finally awakened after an eternity of slumber. His feet touched the leaf-covered ground with surprising gentleness for a creature of such size and power. There was no sound, or rather the sound was the same whisper of wind through the trees, indistinguishable from the forest's own heartbeat. He began to walk, leaving trails that defied all logic. A predator attempting to follow his tracks would end up walking in circles, or worse, moving farther and farther away from Kurupyr's actual direction. It was not magic, but rather a physical manifestation of his role, to protect the forest from those who came with ill intentions, disorienting them, losing them in the green depths where they would never be found again. Kurupyr began to traverse his domain, knowing each tree, each stream, each clearing. He could sense the forest's health through the soles of his inverted feet. Where he stepped, plants grew stronger. Sick trees received new vitality from his presence. Wounded animals found healing in the shadows where he had rested. But Kurupyr also discovered that there were threats. Natural fires were part of the cycle. He understood that. But there were other disturbances. Large herds of sauropods sometimes overconsumed an area, destroying young trees before they could grow. Predators occasionally hunted compulsively, unbalancing specific regions. And there were diseases, plagues that attacked certain tree species, spreading rapidly through the interconnected root networks. The Guardian learned to intervene wisely. He did not prevent death, for he understood that death was necessary for life. But he maintained balance. When an area was being overburdened by herbivores, he used his presence to gently guide them to other regions. When predators became too numerous, he created subtle barriers that forced them to disperse to new territories. When diseases threatened to decimate entire tree species, he channeled the forest's vital energy to strengthen the most resistant ones, allowing them to survive and transmit their resistance to future generations. Chapter 5. The Encounter with the Great Saurs. One day during one of Kurupyr's long walks through the ancient forests, he found a scene that would test his wisdom and compassion for the first time. In a vast clearing, where giant trees had fallen, creating an open space bathed in sunlight. A family of enormous sauropods had established territory. They were magnificent creatures, some of the largest animals that had ever walked the earth. The matriarch of the group was particularly impressive, with a neck so long she could reach the canopies of the tallest trees. But there was a problem. She was trapped. One of her limbs had become wedged between ancient rocks during a recent earthquake, and she had been there for days, unable to free herself, while her family waited anxiously around her. Predators had already detected the vulnerability. At the edges of the clearing, Kurupyr could sense the presence of several theropods, carnivorous dinosaurs that would not normally attack such a large creature, but who recognized an opportunity when they saw one. They waited, patient, knowing that eventually the matriarch would become too weak to defend herself. Kurupyr faced a dilemma. Death was part of nature. The cycle of predator and prey was essential to the forest's balance. But there was something about this situation that seemed wrong. It was not a natural death resulting from the established order of things, but an accident, a geological trap that had captured one of the forest's most magnificent creatures. The guardian made his decision. He approached the trapped matriarch, and for the first time since his manifestation, he spoke. They were not words in the sense we know them, but rather a deep communication, a vibration that resonated in the bones and blood of all creatures who could hear it. It was the voice of the forest itself, and it spoke of compassion, of balance, and of respect for all life. The predators in the shadows retreated, not from fear, but from reverence. They felt the presence of something greater than themselves, something that represented the very essence of the green world they all inhabited. The sauropod matriarch looked at Kurupyr with her large ancient eyes, and in that look, there was understanding. Kurupyr placed his branch-like hands on the rocks that held the creature's leg. He did not use brute force. Instead, he channeled the forest's energy, causing roots to grow and expand beneath the rocks, slowly lifting and moving them. It took hours, but eventually the matriarch was free. She rose, tested her injured leg, and then, in a gesture that seemed surprisingly deliberate, lowered her head toward Kurupyr in a sign of gratitude. The family of sauropods departed, and the predators went to hunt elsewhere. Balance had been maintained, but not through inaction, through wisdom and compassion guided by deep understanding of natural cycles. Chapter 6. The long season's time in the Jurassic flowed differently than it would in the future world. The seasons were longer, more stable. A rainy era could last decades, followed by periods of drought that extended for generations of animals. Kurupyr witnessed all these changes, impassive but always vigilant. During the great rains, he walked through forests transformed into swamps, where trees grew with aerial roots and giant water lilies covered temporary lakes. He helped animals trapped in mud, guided herds to higher ground, and protected pterosaur nests from floods that threatened to sweep away riverbanks. In periods of drought, when streams dried up and undergrowth died, Kurupyr became even more important. He knew every hidden water source, every deep well where moisture still existed. He guided animals to these secret places, keeping them alive until the rains returned. And when natural fires swept across the dry forest, he created barriers of moist earth and fire-resistant vegetation, saving the oldest and most precious trees. But not all of Kurupyr's encounters were peaceful. There were creatures that did not respect balance, that killed for pleasure and not for necessity. There were parasites and plagues that threatened to destroy entire ecosystems. Against these threats, Kurupyr showed his fiercer side. He could grow in size, becoming as tall as the oldest trees. His arms transformed into thorny branches capable of piercing thick dinosaur hide. His voice became a roar that echoed for kilometers, making the earth tremble and animals flee in panic. He was love and fury, protection and destruction, all encapsulated in a form that was simultaneously plant and animal, physical and spiritual. Chapter 7. The Network of Ancient Trees. As millennia passed, Kurupyr developed an even deeper connection with the oldest trees of the forest. There were some truly ancient giants, araucarias that had witnessed the birth and death of mountains conifers whose roots penetrated so deeply into the earth that they touched the hot currents of the mantle. Tree ferns that had grown, died, and grown again countless times in the same place each generation, building upon the roots of the previous one. These ancestral trees became the pillars of Kurupyr's domain. He visited each one regularly, placing his hands on their ancient bark and sharing consciousness with them. Through these connections, he could sense events occurring thousands of kilometers away, a storm forming over the distant ocean, a volcanic eruption in lands that would one day separate from Gondwana, the migration of gigantic herds across plains beyond the mountains. The network of ancient trees also served as the forest's living memory. They remembered climatic patterns that repeated every few million years, cycles of extinction and renewal, the rise and fall of species. Kurupyr learned from this memory, becoming not just a guardian of the present but a preserver of the past and a planner for the future. He began to plant seeds deliberately, creating sacred groves in strategic locations. These groves would serve as refuges, places where biodiversity would be protected, where rare species could survive, where the purest essence of the primitive forest would be preserved. Some of these groves were hidden in deep valleys, others atop isolated plateaus, and some on islands within large lakes. Chapter 8: The Great Earthquake. An event that would be etched in the forest's collective memory occurred when Kurupyr had already walked the earth for millions of years. It was an earthquake of incomparable magnitude, caused by tectonic movements that would eventually separate Gondwana into distinct continents. The earth shook for days. Mountains arose where there had been plains. Lakes were drained instantly while others formed in newly created depressions. Great fissures opened in the surface, swallowing ancient trees and entire animals. Volcanoes erupted along fault lines, covering the sky with ash and obscuring the sun. Kurupyr worked tirelessly during this period of chaos. He guided entire herds away from expanding crevasses, used his superhuman strength to fell trees and create bridges over newly formed abysses, and channeled energy to stabilize slopes that threatened to slide and bury entire valleys. But even Kurupyr could not be everywhere at once. Vast areas of the forest were destroyed. Entire species of ancient trees, some of which had existed since before Kurupyr's own birth, were extinct within days. He felt each loss as physical pain in his green core. When the earthquake finally ceased and the earth became relatively stable again, Kurupyr faced a transformed forest. But he did not despair. Instead, he began the long work of restoration. He collected seeds from surviving trees and planted them in new areas. He helped displaced animals find new territories, and slowly, very slowly, the forest began to regenerate. Something remarkable happened during this time of recovery. The forest that grew after the great earthquake was different, more diverse, more resilient. New plant species that had remained rare and obscure before the disaster now flourished in the altered conditions. Animals that had been forced to migrate to new territories found ecological niches they had never explored before. The destruction, as painful as it had been, had opened the way for profound renewal. Kurupyr learned an important lesson. Sometimes protection does not mean preventing all changes, but rather facilitating adaptation and recovery. He was still the guardian, but he had become a wiser guardian. Chapter 9. The Small Beings. Although Kurupyr was often occupied with large-scale issues, migrating herds, forest fires, devastating storms, he never neglected the small beings that inhabited his forest. In fact, he had a special fondness for the smallest inhabitants of the green world. The primitive mammals that lived in the shadows of dinosaurs were particularly fascinating to him. They were small, furry creatures, predominantly nocturnal, that dug complex burrows beneath tree roots and fed on insects, seeds, and occasionally eggs. Kurupyr saw them not just as they were, but as they could become. There was something about these small mammals that intrigued him, an intelligence different from that of the great soars, a flexibility and adaptability that suggested great future potential. He protected them carefully, creating safe microhabitats where they could thrive, without being constantly threatened by much larger predators. Insects also received his attention. Primitive butterflies, though very different from those that would exist in future eras, already pollinated cycads and other plants with rudimentary flowers. Enormous beetles excavated tunnels in dead wood, accelerating decomposition and recycling nutrients back into the soil. Dragonflies the size of birds hunted over lakes and streams, controlling populations of smaller insects. Kurupyr understood that these small beings were as essential to the forest's health as the tallest trees or most imposing dinosaurs. He created special gardens, areas where primitive flowers grew in profusion, where beneficial insects could reproduce undisturbed, where the fundamental processes of pollination and decomposition were protected and optimized. Chapter 10. The Cycle of Waters. Water was the life force that permeated all aspects of Kurupyr's domain, and he developed a deep understanding of its cycles and patterns. He knew every hidden spring in the distant mountains, every stream that wound through dense forests, every tranquil lake where sauropods drank at dawn. During rainy epochs when tropical monsoons poured water for weeks on end, Kurupyr walked through flooded forests, observing how life adapted to liquid abundance. Trees developed aerial roots that could absorb oxygen from the air when their main roots were submerged. Primitive fish swam among tree trunks, feeding on insects and seeds that fell into the water. Large amphibians thrived in these temporarily aquatic environments. But water could also be destructive. Flash floods caused by intense storms could sweep away entire riverbanks, destroying nests, drowning animals, and uprooting young trees. Kurupyr learned to read the signs of impending floods, the changing color in mountain streams, the nervous behavior of certain animals, the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. When he sensed a flood coming, he worked quickly to alert the forest's inhabitants. His voice would echo through the trees, a deep and resonant call that was understood by all creatures as a warning. Animals that were normally territorial among themselves ran side by side to higher ground. Primitive birds and pterosaurs took flight en masse. Even great predators ceased their hunts to seek safety. And when the flood passed, Kurupyr surveyed the damage, helping where he could. He freed animals trapped in mud, cleared debris that blocked important streams, and planted seeds in areas where young trees had been swept away, ensuring the forest would regenerate quickly. Chapter 11. The Dance of Stellar Seasons. On cloudless nights when the primitive moon, significantly closer to Earth than it would be in future eras, bathed the forest in intense silver light, Kurupyr sometimes stopped his tireless vigil and simply contemplated the sky. The stars in the Jurassic were different. The Milky Way stretched across the sky in a bright arc of billions of stars, unobscured by any light pollution, for there were no cities or civilizations yet to create such a thing. Kurupyr could see constellations that would no longer exist in the future sky, stars that would die long before humans walked the earth. There was something deeply meditative about these moments. Kurupyr, who was ancient even by the standards of an ancient era, contemplated his existence and his purpose. He was consciousness made manifest, the very forest given physical form. But he was also lonely in a way that few creatures could understand. There were no others like him. The animals, however intelligent some were, lived in the present and in instinct. The ancient trees, though wise and connected, did not have the mobility or capacity for action that he possessed. Kurupyr was unique, singular, the first and perhaps the only one of his kind. But this loneliness was not bitter. Instead, it reinforced his sense of purpose. He had not been created to have companionship, but to be a guardian. His satisfaction did not come from social relationships, but from fulfilling his sacred duty, to protect, nurture, and maintain the balance of the green world that was simultaneously his home and his own expanded body. Under these ancient stars, Kurupyr sometimes sang. They were not songs with words, but deep melodies that resonated through the trees, harmonizing with the whisper of wind and the nocturnal song of insects and small animals. These songs were prayers and celebrations, laments and joys, all interwoven in an expression of the unique experience of being the guardian of the first forests. Chapter 12. The Wisdom of Ashes. As eons passed, Kurupyr witnessed countless fires. Some were small, consuming only a few dead trees and clearing the understory of excessive vegetation. Others were catastrophic, sweeping across tens of square kilometers and transforming vibrant forests into lunar landscapes of ash and charred stumps. Initially, Kurupyr fought fires with all his strength. He felled trees to create barriers, channeled water from distant streams to flood the flames, and used his own body as a shield to protect particularly ancient and valuable trees. And although he often managed to save significant parts of the forest, he could never save everything. But with time, he began to perceive something fundamental. Fire was not just destruction, it was also renewal. Ashes enriched the soil, making available nutrients that had been trapped in dead wood. Sunlight that now reached the forest floor allowed new plants to grow, species that had been dormant, waiting for such conditions. Seeds of certain trees only germinated after being exposed to the intense heat of flames. Kurupyr learned to work with fire instead of always against it. He began to conduct small, controlled burns during wet seasons, when they could be easily contained but still fulfill their ecological role. He identified areas where vegetation had accumulated dangerously, creating risk of immense and uncontrollable fires, and deliberately allowed small fires to clear these areas before the danger grew too great. This was another aspect of his growing wisdom. Understanding that protection does not always mean preventing harm, but rather allowing natural changes in ways that minimize suffering, while maximizing renewal and growth. Chapter 13. The Visitors from the Sea. The forest Kurupyr protected did not exist in isolation. It extended to the shores of ancient seas, where waves lapped at beaches of black volcanic sand and limestone cliffs formed from shells of long-extinct marine creatures. Kurupyr occasionally walked these beaches, where the green world met the blue world. Here he witnessed a completely different but equally fascinating ecosystem. Marine reptiles, long-necked plesiosaurs, dolphin-like ichthyosaurs, and immense predatory mosasaurs hunted in shallow waters. Sometimes these marine creatures ventured too close to shore and became stranded when the tide went out. Kurupyr helped where he could, using his considerable strength to push smaller marine reptiles back into deeper waters. For the larger ones, he could do nothing but offer comfort, while they waited for the tide's return, protecting them from scavenging pterosaurs that circled above, scenting an easy meal. In the intertidal zone, where forest gave way to primitive mangroves, Kurupyr watched with fascination the extraordinary adaptation of life. Trees with breathing roots grew in salty mud, creating nurseries for young fish and marine invertebrates. Giant crabs climbed trunks during high tide, while marine snails the size of human fists grazed on algae that grew on exposed roots. These transitional environments taught Kurupyr about boundaries and connections. There was no real separation between the terrestrial and marine worlds. Both were part of a larger system, with nutrients flowing between them, animals migrating from one to another, and each depending on the other, in subtle but fundamental ways. Chapter 14. The First Great Extinction. Then came a period that would test Kurupyr like never before. The causes were multiple and complex, a series of massive volcanic eruptions that lasted thousands of years, releasing toxic gases and obscuring the sun with ash. Changes in sea levels that drained vital coastal habitats, and wild climate fluctuations that oscillated between extreme heat and sudden cold. Kurupyr watched with growing horror as entire species disappeared. Trees that had dominated the forest for millions of years withered and died, unable to adapt to the new conditions. Dinosaurs that had been abundant became rare, and then disappeared completely. Even some of the small mammals he had protected so carefully succumbed to the drastic changes. The Guardian worked tirelessly, trying to save what he could. He created refuges in deep valleys where the microclimate remained more stable. He transported seeds of threatened species to new locations where conditions might be more favorable. He guided migratory animals to areas where food could still be found. But for the first time since his manifestation, Kurupyr faced the limits of his power. He could influence much, but could not control the global climate, could not stop volcanic eruptions, could not reverse chemical changes in the oceans that affected the entire food chain. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be guardian of a world that was constantly in flux, constantly changing in ways beyond his control. The pain of this era left deep marks on his green core. He felt the loss of each extinct species as if it were part of his own body being torn away. And in a way, it was exactly that. For he was the consciousness of the forest, and every living being was part of that collective consciousness. Chapter 15. The Renewal. But life, Kurupyr learned, was incredibly resilient. After the extinctions, after the chaos, came renewal. New species evolved to fill the ecological niches left empty. Some were modified descendants of ancient species, others were completely new forms, experimenting with survival strategies that had never been attempted before. Kurupyr witnessed the emergence of new dinosaur lineages, better adapted to the changed conditions. He saw the appearance of the first true flowering plants, small and primitive still, but representing an evolutionary innovation that would eventually completely transform the forest's appearance. He observed mammals diversifying into forms that began to explore new ways of life. The forest that emerged after the crisis was different from what had existed before, but no less magnificent. It was more complex in some ways, with new symbiotic relationships forming, new nutrient cycles establishing themselves, new dynamics between predators and prey developing. Kurupyr adapted his protection techniques to the new conditions. He learned the needs of new plant species, the behaviors of new animals, the patterns of new ecosystems. His wisdom, already deep, became even more comprehensive. And something else changed. Kurupyr developed a deeper acceptance of impermanence. He was still a guardian, still protected and nurtured, but now understood that his role was not to preserve the past in amber, but rather to facilitate the continuous adaptation and evolution of life. Protection did not mean stagnation, but rather giving life the space and resources needed to flourish, change, and transform. Chapter 16. The Sacred Places. As even more millions of years accumulated, Kurupyr established what he thought of as sacred places. Special areas scattered throughout the extent of his forest where conditions were particularly favorable for life, where biodiversity flourished in its richest form, where the very essence of the forest seemed concentrated. The first of these places was the Valley of Eternal Mists, where high mountains created a pocket of unique climate. Clouds remained trapped in the valley during most of the year, keeping everything in a humid twilight, where mosses and fungi grew in surprising profusion. Trees covered with epiphytes, plants that grew upon other plants, created vertical gardens of stunning beauty. Crystal streams ran over lichen-covered stones, creating constant music of moving water. There was also the grove of ancient giants, where the oldest trees of the forest grew. Some of these trees had been born before even Kurupyr took form, and their roots penetrated so deeply into the earth that they touched the very mineral veins of the planet. Their trunks were so thick that it would take dozens of humans holding hands to circle them, if humans already existed. Kurupyr visited these ancient trees regularly, sitting among their roots and sharing consciousness with them, absorbing their memories of long-past eras. The Lake of Deep Life was another sacred place, a body of water fed by underground springs that never dried, even during the most severe droughts. Its waters were incredibly rich in minerals and nutrients, and a surprising variety of aquatic life inhabited its depths. Giant dragonfly nymphs hunted in shallow waters, while primitive armored fish swam in the depths. During the dry season, animals from across the region converged on this lake, and Kurupyr maintained a sacred peace there, where even predators and prey drank side by side without violence. And there was the Garden of First Flowers, where the most primitive angiosperms, the first true flowering plants, had found perfect conditions to evolve and diversify. It was a place of vivid colors in contrast to the greens and browns predominant in the rest of the forest. Pollinating insects buzzed constantly among the flowers, and Kurupyr spent much time observing these interactions, fascinated by the intricate dance between plant and insect that was just beginning to develop. These sacred places served not only as refuges of biodiversity, but also as sources of seeds and animals that could recolonize areas damaged by disasters. They were the forest's living gene banks, preserved and protected by the guardian against all dangers. Chapter 17. The Silent Teaching. Although Kurupyr could not speak in the conventional sense, or perhaps chose not to most of the time, he had developed methods of teaching and guiding the creatures under his protection. They were not explicit lessons, but rather a form of knowledge transmitted through presence, example, and subtle influence. Young dinosaurs that became separated from their herds frequently found Kurupyr in their paths. His presence calmed them, and somehow they intuitively felt the direction where their families could be found. It was not that Kurupyr told them where to go, but his very nature, being part of the forest and connected to all things in it, somehow guided the lost back to where they belonged. He also taught through demonstration. Small mammals watched him dig certain edible roots and learned which were safe. Primitive birds noticed which trees he frequently visited and learned that these trees produced the best fruits or harbored the most nutritious insects. Even the great herbivores learned migration patterns by following the confusing, but somehow intuitively correct trails that Kurupyr left. There was also something deeper happening. The trees that grew where Kurupyr frequently rested developed special characteristics: greater disease resistance, faster growth, more viable seeds. It was as if his presence left an epigenetic impression, subtly altering the plant's development in ways that benefited them. And animals that lived near Kurupyr's sacred places began to show different behaviors. They were more cooperative, less aggressively territorial. Predators hunted only what was necessary, never in excess. Herbivores moved from area to area more systematically, allowing vegetation to recover before returning. It was as if the guardian's wisdom gradually permeated the entire web of life under his watch. Chapter 18. The Dreams of Earth. Kurupyr did not sleep in the sense that animals slept, but he had periods of deep quietude where his consciousness partially withdrew, diving into the forest's roots and connecting with the slow geological processes of the planet itself. In these meditative states, he experienced something that could be called dreams, visions that were part memory, part prediction, part something entirely different. He saw the distant past when Earth was young and covered with primitive oceans, when the first photosynthetic organisms began to fill the atmosphere with oxygen, completely transforming the planet. He saw the future, not with clarity, but in vague and fragmented impressions. Mountains that would rise where there were now plains, oceans that would open, dividing continents, climates that would change dramatically, and creatures very different from anything that existed now, walking upon the land, flying through the skies, swimming in the oceans. In these dream visions, Kurupyr sometimes glimpsed a strange creature, bipedal, hairless over much of its body, with skillful hands and eyes that shone with an intelligence different from anything he knew. These visions were confusing, for these creatures seemed capable of both great beauty and great destruction. They created wonderful things but also destroyed entire forests, polluted crystal waters, and altered the planet's very climate. Kurupyr did not fully understand these visions. Were they prophecies, possibilities, or just the random wanderings of a consciousness so ancient and complex that it sometimes generated patterns without meaning? But the visions persisted, especially one. He saw himself, far in the future, still walking through forests, but very different forests, in a much changed world. And he saw these bipedal creatures telling stories about him around campfires, passing legends from generation to generation, keeping alive the memory of the forest guardian even in times where few would believe such a being could really exist. Chapter 19. The Cycle of Generations. One of the most fascinating aspects of Kurupyr's existence was his unique perspective on time. While individual animals lived and died within decades, and even the longest-lived trees eventually fell after a few thousand years, Kurupyr persisted, witnessing generation after generation of all species under his protection. He saw entire dinosaur lineages evolve, A species of small herbivore he had known at the beginning of his vigil had descendants that became progressively larger over millions of years. He observed each stage of this transformation. The first slightly larger individuals who had advantage in reaching higher foliage, their even larger descendants, and eventually giants that dominated the forest canopy. But he also saw the reverse. Large species becoming progressively smaller when conditions changed, adapting to scarcer resources or to new predators. He saw species divide into multiple new species when populations were isolated by geographical changes. He witnessed extinctions and emergences, declines and ascents in an endless cycle of change. Trees also told their own evolutionary stories. Kurupyr observed how different species developed new survival strategies. Some trees developed thicker bark to resist fire. Others evolved deeper roots to reach water during prolonged droughts. The first angiosperms constantly experimented with different flower and fruit forms, discovering new ways to attract pollinators and seed dispersers. This deep-time perspective gave Kurupyr a patience that no short-lived being could possess. He knew that changes that seemed catastrophic in the short term could lead to wonderful evolutionary innovations in the long term. He learned to see not just the present, but also the echoes of the past and the seeds of the future in each moment. Chapter 20. The Arrival of the Bees. One of the most significant events Kurupyr witnessed was the evolution of the first true bees, social insects specialized in collecting pollen and nectar from the expanding flowering plants. This was a transformative moment in the forest's history. Before bees, pollination was a more random process. Wind carried pollen from one plant to another with low efficiency. Beetles and other insects visited flowers, but incidentally, without specialization. But bees changed everything. Kurupyr observed the first solitary bees, small creatures that built individual nests and visited specific flowers with impressive regularity. Then came the bees that lived in small colonies, and eventually the truly social species with queens, workers, and drones organized into complex societies. The impact was profound. Flowering plants that had been relatively rare began to diversify explosively, each species evolving specialized flower forms that attracted specific types of bees. Colors became more varied and vibrant. Aromas became more complex. The very structure of flowers changed, developing landing platforms, nectar guides, and elaborate mechanisms to ensure that visitors would be covered with pollen. Kurupyr created special gardens for these new partnerships between plants and insects. He ensured there were always flowers available throughout all seasons, so that bee colonies could prosper year-round. He protected wild hives from predators and parasites, and in return, the bees became important agents in maintaining the forest's biodiversity, spreading plant genes over great distances, and ensuring that even isolated individual trees could reproduce. Chapter 21. The Guardian and the Tree Spirits. As millions of years accumulated, Kurupyr began to perceive that he was not completely alone in his uniqueness. Although he was the only manifested physical guardian, there were other presences in the forest, more ephemeral, less defined, but definitely real. They were the spirits of the oldest trees, consciousnesses that had emerged in a manner similar to his, but that remained anchored in their plant bodies. They could not move as he could, but they had their own form of existence and consciousness. Each great ancient tree was, in a certain sense, an individual with its own personality. There was the great matriarch of the northern valley, an araucaria so ancient that her age could not be measured in thousands, but in millions of years. She had survived countless storms, fires, droughts, and floods. Her wisdom was deep and serene, and Kurupyr often sought her counsel when facing difficult dilemmas. There were the twins of the western cliff, two primitive sequoias that had grown side by side, their roots so intertwined that they were practically a single entity. They shared thoughts and experiences in a way that even Kurupyr did not fully understand. They represented for him the possibility of perfect union and cooperation. And there was the solitary elder of Lake Island, a gymnosperm of a species that had been common in past eras, but was now almost extinct. She was melancholic but resilient, the last of her lineage, keeping alive the memory of long-forgotten times. Kurupyr conversed with these tree spirits through methods that transcended language. It was a direct communion from consciousness to consciousness, facilitated by the network of roots and fungi that connected all the forest's plants. In these conversations, he found not just information but also comfort. He was not as alone as he had thought. There were others who shared, at least partially, his unique nature. Chapter 22. The Great Migration. One of the most spectacular events Kurupyr witnessed occurred when global climate changes forced a massive migration of species across the supercontinent. The climate was becoming colder in polar regions, and many species that had prospered there for millions of years now needed to move to warmer areas. The migration lasted generations. It was not a simple, direct movement, but rather a gradual process of populations expanding toward the tropics while dying out in the colder regions. Kurupyr observed enormous herds of herbivorous dinosaurs moving slowly through his forest, followed by their predators. The challenge was immense. These migrant animals competed with resident species for resources. Diseases spread when different populations came into contact. Territorial conflicts erupted between herds that had never encountered each other before. Kurupyr worked tirelessly to facilitate this great migration. He created corridors through the densest parts of the forest, strategically felling trees to create wide paths where herds could pass. He guided migrants to areas where food was abundant, avoiding regions already overburdened. When conflicts threatened to explode, his presence served as a pacifying force, reminding all creatures that they were part of something greater. It took centuries, but eventually a new balance was established. Some of the migrant species permanently integrated into tropical ecosystems, while others continued their journey beyond Kurupyr's domain boundaries. The forest was transformed by this infusion of biodiversity, becoming richer and more complex than ever. Chapter 23. The Living Legacy. Kurupyr began to think deliberately about legacy. He knew, through his visions and the wisdom of the oldest trees, that even greater changes were coming. The supercontinent itself would one day fragment. Climates would change drastically. New life forms would emerge while others disappeared. How could he ensure that his work, the protection and cultivation of the forest, would continue even when he could no longer be everywhere? How could he preserve the essence of what the forest represented? His answer was to create what he thought of as consciousness seeds. In especially powerful places, the nodes where multiple ancient trees connected, where underground water currents crossed deep roots, where the earth's energy seemed concentrated, Kurupyr planted part of his own essence. They were not copies of him, but rather fragments of his consciousness that could, under the right conditions, awaken and serve as lesser guardians. He imagined a future where each great forest could have its own protector, each one a unique expression of the green consciousness he represented. Some of these fragments would eventually awaken. Others would remain dormant for eras, waiting for the right moment. But all carried Kurupyr's memory, his wisdom, his deep love for the forest and all its creatures. This process of creating consciousness seeds took thousands of years. Kurupyr traveled to the most distant corners of his domain, to places he rarely visited, ensuring that even the most remote areas had this potential for future protection. Chapter 24. The End of an Era. Then came a sign that Kurupyr could not ignore. The oldest trees whispered through their roots. Something big was coming. The stars seemed different at night, not in their positions, but in how they were perceived. Animals were restless without apparent reason. The earth itself trembled occasionally with small tremors that were not normal earthquakes. Kurupyr did not know exactly what was coming, but he felt it would be significant. His visions became more frequent and intense, images of a fundamental change in the world, a transition between eras. He intensified his protection efforts. He visited each of his sacred places, reinforcing them, ensuring that the most vulnerable species had safe refuges. He spoke at length with the ancient tree spirits, sharing knowledge and wisdom they might need in difficult times. And then, one night, He had the clearest vision he had ever experienced. He saw a flaming rock falling from the sky, larger than mountains. He saw the impact create an explosion of energy that would vaporize everything within a radius of thousands of kilometers. He saw a heat wave that would set entire forests ablaze. He saw a winter that would last years, with the sun obscured by dust and ash. Kurupyr understood. A mass extinction was coming, one that would make the previous ones he had witnessed seem small in comparison. The dinosaurs that had dominated Earth for more than 100 million years, much longer than even he had existed, would see their reign come to an end. But life would continue. It always continued, and he would be there to help it, to protect the seeds of the future, to ensure that the forest, in some form, would survive to see a new day. Epilogue. The Eternal Guardian. Millions of years have passed since that ancient time. The Great Impact came and went, taking with it the non-avian dinosaurs but leaving other survivors. The supercontinent Gondwana fragmented, and the land that had once been a continuous forest became multiple continents separated by vast oceans. Mammals, once small and discrete creatures, inherited the Earth. They grew in size and diversity, evolved complex intelligences, and eventually gave rise to primates, and from primates emerged humans. And Kurupyr? He still walks in the forests, now much changed but still essentially the same green idea they always were. His appearances are rare, his interventions subtle, but he remains the eternal guardian, protecting what remains of the great forests, reminding an increasingly human-dominated world that there is something older, deeper, more fundamental than ambition and greed. The indigenous peoples of South America, particularly the Tupi-Guarani, know his legends. They call him by the name that echoed through the ages, Kurupyr, Kurupyra, the protector of the forest, with his backward-facing feet, punishing those who destroy the forest without necessity or respect. Few know that their stories reach back not hundreds, but millions of years, that the being they describe really exists, and that he walked among trees long before any human being drew the first cave painting. Today, in a world where forests fall under chainsaws and tractors, where climate change threatens entire ecosystems, Kurupyr works harder than ever. He cannot stop all destruction. He never could. But he can protect refugees, can help species survive in preserved pockets, can plant seeds of renewal even in the midst of devastation. And perhaps, if humans learn to listen, truly listen, with more than just their ears, they might perceive his presence in the forests that still exist. Not as a frightening figure from folklore legends, but as what he truly is, a loving guardian of all green things, an ancient consciousness dedicated to protecting life in its most fundamental and beautiful form. For as long as there are forests, as long as there are trees that connect their roots and share wisdom through living soil, as long as there is the whisper of wind through leaves, and the song of birds at dawn, Kurupyr will be there. The guardian of the first forests, the protector of the eternal green, the silent voice of wild nature, still walking as he walked 146 million years ago with his backward-facing feet, creating trails that confuse but that, for those with pure hearts and true intentions, always lead to the living, pulsing heart of the ancestral forest.